I want to go back and review a little bit of what we ended with last week and ask a question. Can I get a show of hands of everybody who did their homework from last week? All right. I do have some. We'll look for that number to increase as we go on through the class the rest of the summer. We're going to talk about the Beatitudes in just a few minutes. But one of the things in figuring out how to be more missional, in how to take the story of Jesus and take Jesus to the people around us in our community, is the first place we should go and look is, what did Jesus do? And how did he do it? And so let's look at a few scriptures briefly. And I mentioned this last week and just briefly, but I wanted to go back and get the actual passage, because it is so significant when we look at and we unravel this passage and what it says about the nature of Jesus and how he related to people. In Matthew 8:1, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. So I want you to picture this. There's a lot of folks around. Probably many, many hundreds, could be thousands. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him. What do we know about that? The crowd probably parted. Everybody's getting back from this leper because nobody would get close to him. Okay? But they're watching from a distance and they're seeing all this, and yet Jesus allows that man to come right up to him. Gets even better. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So he's already showing he's got the faith. He's watched Jesus enough to know he can do it. He's just asking him to. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Did anybody in that time ever touch a leper? The lepers didn't even touch each other. You think about how often we need, as human beings, the touch of another person. I don't know if y'all have heard the story. During the Soviet Union, they did all kinds of stuff that we would never think of doing here, but they did some sort of a study on orphan babies that were in orphanages, newborns. And they took 100 of them and divided them into two groups. I think it was 100 in each group in these hospitals and orphanages when they were newly born. And one group they treated normally. All the nurses would hold them and care for them and feed them, and they're handling them, they're touching them. The others, they would feed them, but they did not have any human contact. And almost all of them died because they'd had no human contact. They had the nourishment, they got fed, but they didn't have any touch. And we know now that one of the most important things for a newborn is to have that skin-to-skin contact with their mother and their father. That's where the bonding begins to happen and begins to occur. And so for a person to be deprived of the contact with their family and all of these things, it wasn't just the disease, it was the total isolation that they had to deal with. And Jesus didn't even hesitate, reached out and touched the man, said, "I'm willing, be clean." And he was. And the funny part is, this is where you chuckle. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone." I'm saying, Jesus, really? You got hundreds or thousands of people standing around watching this, and you're saying, "Don't tell anyone"? They may have said it low because all the rest of the folks are kind of far off now. But you have to laugh at that one. "Go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." And so when we look at that passage, it's fascinating to see what Jesus did. Well, then the question is, as we go through and look at these next 3 or 4 verses, what is the message for us that we need to seriously consider as we're looking at how do we reach out to the people in the community around us that are going to be receptive to the message of Christ? Yes.
Leprosy is incurable
Right.
at that time.
Right.
So if it didn't work, okay, from the crowd mentality perspective, if it didn't work, game's over.
Right. That's a good point.
Okay, so from their perspective, this can't happen.
I know.
This can't happen.
And they're all watching Jesus, and he reaches out and touches him.
No cure. There was nothing that they could do to mitigate the disease whatsoever.
And known to be highly contagious through touch.
The only thing they could do was put them off somewhere until they all died.
Right.
So this was unheard of.
That it just increases the significance of what he did. As we go on, Jim, thank you for that. In Matthew 8 and 5, we read about the faith of the centurion. So here's a Roman centurion who came to Jesus, and he had walked several miles away from his home to get to where Jesus was, and goes up to him and asks him to heal his servant. He wasn't coming on behalf of himself. He had a servant that obviously he cared very much about and was concerned about his health. And he said he was paralyzed and really in dire trouble. And then he has the humility to say, I am under authority and I have authority over people, and I don't even qualify for you to come into my home. So just say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus said, okay, it's done. And he did it. And the centurion went back home in full faith. And Jesus kind of at that time in that passage in 8:5 gives a message to those around him about not seeing that level of faith even among the people of Israel, and kind of encouraging them to reconsider. And so that's something that we need to reconsider ourselves too. Evangelism, we all come to that kind of an activity with all kinds of thoughts and ideas and concepts about how we do it. And we're going to talk more. One of the things I was telling Marvin a few minutes ago about this class that I was excited to teach is because we talk about a lot that we need to go be evangelistic. We need to go be missional. What does that mean? How do we do it? I told Marvin, I'm a process guy. I love to watch a show on how things are made, always have, And I've made a few things myself over the years with my own hands. And so to me, there's a step-by-step process and a sequence that you have to go through. But there's lots of different processes and lots of different ways to accomplish the same thing. And that is also characteristic because each one of us has the ability to connect with somebody else in a different way. Years ago, I was in the mortgage business, and we had an older black gentleman, retired Army sergeant. We had several young people who were in their 20s, and then we had a couple of folks in the 40s. I was, I guess at that time, up into my 50s. And so we're all out trying to sell and go into real estate offices and deal with real estate agents. And we had conversations in the office about the fact that every single one of us had the ability to connect. And we had some people, I preface, some of the younger folks on the team were saying, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to go into that real estate office, I want to be able to have that one kind of claim as my territory, and nobody else here is going to go over there. And I said, wait a minute. What if we take Odell, who's a man in his late 50s, who's black, a retired Army, and he could go in there. There's going to be people that he will relate to that aren't even going to give you the time of day. And it's like, okay. And that's the same way with us. Every one of us comes from a different background and has a different ability to do something. But one thing that we are going to need to do, all of us together, is think about how we're going to do this differently from what we've thought about in the past. We are going to talk about, as we go through this summer, some methodologies and some things that can be done here in our community. And we're going to look at the community that's around the building and look at the population and the demographics of it to say, what can we do to go out and be Jesus to this? And I appreciate so much a lesson that David taught quite a few months ago. It may have been a year or more, where he talked about the attractional model of evangelism versus, David, help me out on this. Was the other side of it? Missional. I should have known that one. The missional methodology. We always have kind of looked at attracting people to come here. And I believe very much in that, getting signage out on the street and putting ads on we've done that in local outreach on Facebook and Instagram and things like that to get people to come here. But Jesus didn't do that. He didn't sit and wait. He went out to people. And that's what we're looking at here. Let's look at another thing that Jesus did in the way he dealt with people. Matthew 20, 29 through 34. Again, he's traveling along, and these two blind men are sitting beside the road, and they realized in hearing the crowd going by that Jesus was coming. And they called out to him, "Master, help us." And the crowd tried to shut him up. They said, "Be quiet, leave him alone." And they wouldn't be quieted. And so they got Jesus' attention, and he comes over to them. And it says he had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight. What I should have put in here in putting this together is what preceded that. He walks up to them and he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said, "Master, we want our sight." And he had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received sight and followed him. As we look at Matthew 14:14, the next verse down, when Jesus landed, get the right slide here. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. We look at the next verse, Mark 6:34. Again, Jesus is landing, and that means he landed in a boat at that time, not an airplane. That's when I excerpt these verses and you don't have the whole context, you don't always get that picture. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And when you read that verse, you think about that for a minute. How many people around us in our community are like sheep without a shepherd? And many of them don't even know it yet. But, folks, I can tell you there are some that do. And they're looking and they're open. And those are the ones that God is calling them to himself. And he wants us to be the hands and feet and the voice to share him with those people. There are people who are receptive to his message everywhere. But here's something interesting. As important as what Jesus did are the things he did not do. How many of you remember the wristband that used to go around and be very popular? It said WWJD on it. What did that mean? Most everybody knows. Well, we talk about what would Jesus do, but what would Jesus, sometimes here's the challenge for us in what we're doing or not doing. What would Jesus not do? So help me out here. What was one of the characteristics of Jesus' ministry in the things that he did? One significant thing he did not do with all of the people that he interacted with, came in contact with, healed, helped, interfaced with in some way. Pardon?
He did it for free.
I'm sorry.
He did it for free.
For free. Yes. He didn't ask for anything in return. What else? Marvin?
He didn't force anything on anybody. He didn't force people to take a blessing or to be healed, or he answered requests and he offered, but he didn't force.
It's something important you just said, because that's what we was in this other verse. He answered requests. What does that mean he had to do first? Listen. What did he do with the two blind men? He asked them, what do you want me to do for you? The other thing, there's one more thing we haven't gotten to yet, probably the most significant and the one that we have the most difficulty with because of other people's perceptions. Yes, sir. Right. Exactly. He just served, right? We're finding more things here than I had already had in my list when I was doing this, but there's still one more thing that Jesus didn't do.
I was going to say that, but in thinking about it, there's one more thing that he didn't do. He didn't assume what the problem was.
Okay. There's one more I hadn't thought of.
Oftentimes you can take one look at somebody, you can assume what the problem is and just go right into it.
Right. That's a good, very, very important point for us as we're doing things too, Jim. It reminds me of the interaction with the man, the crippled man that he healed. And he ends up in this interchange asking him, do you want to be healed? I mean, so and that was interesting because he went back and forth with him about 3 times before he got down to the end and said, Master, I want to walk. And sometimes he asks people frequently, if you look at all of the passages where he has an interaction with somebody, do you believe that this can happen? And there is one passage, and I should have put it in here, but you got to be selective in order to stay within the time limit, where it says that he went to a certain area and he couldn't do very many miracles because of their unbelief. And so faith and the willingness to believe, these blind men showed that, the centurion showed that. We know of other verses and passages where he has asked people, do you believe? Because they haven't exhibited that faith up front. But we're still missing one thing. Did he ever pass judgment on anyone? Even who? One's real big example of that. No, but her too. There's one more. What'd you say? Oh, the woman at the well? Okay. What about the woman brought to him who had been caught in the act of adultery? Of course, here's all these Pharisees around, which of course it was a setup, as we know, trying to get him to pass judgment on her. But he never did. He had a prostitute come, anoint his feet, and in front of this Pharisee and all the other folks with him, and they're saying, you realize who this is that's doing that to you? And instead he chastises them, and he tells her to go, her faith has made her whole, go and sin no more. He tells a lot of people, go and sin no more. He told the lame guy, he said, go and stop sinning. But he never did pass judgment on anybody. He did pass judgment on the Pharisees, but not on any of the people that he helped and served. And that is probably one of the things that we may encounter as we're out talking to people. Everybody's got a perception. They've got a perception about the churches of Christ. They've got a perception about Christians in general. And often these perceptions that they have are what hinder having a conversation. And that's why as we think about what we have to do, it's how we have a mindset of being able to listen to people, to find out what their needs are and to meet their needs and to follow the pattern of Jesus in doing that. And that's what is kind of the foundational stuff that we're going to talk about a little bit more in these first few weeks, and then get into some more practical applications. But last week, to come back now, I asked you to read the Beatitudes and think about your own personal strengths, because we've all got them. We've all got certain gifts and certain talents. And I mentioned last week that I always used to think that, well, I could pick one or two here that would apply to me, until I heard a preacher say one time, he talked about these, And it said we need to realize that we're supposed to all have all of these characteristics. But I want to jump ahead just a little bit, and I'm going to do an audible here. By extension to the Beatitudes, we want to add the fruit of the Spirit. And in Galatians 5:21-23, it says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those, I would submit to you, are probably the most important things that we need to make a part of our thinking when we're working with people outside in the community, and we're serving and doing things for other folks, is not judging, but just serving their needs, finding out what their needs are. We're going to talk about some studies that the Barna Group does as we go forward. They do a lot of research into church and church growth and what's happening with churches. And you all know church membership and church attendance has been declining nationally for several decades now. And the churches of Christ are not immune to that. And Barna has studied that a lot, and we're gonna deal with a lot of it as we go forward, and getting hard numbers and helping us understand. For instance, they have done a number of studies on different generational groups, because there are different perceptions and attitudes among people at different age levels throughout the community around us. And so as we look at those, we will hopefully have better information about how we can reach out to different groups. One thing is that we're doing that I've learned recently. I've got 3 examples here with my iPad mini and my cell phone. How many of you have one of these? Smartphone of some kind. We're doing advertising on Facebook and Instagram. And we did some Google AdWords advertising recently for Easter. And in getting the reports back on the responses and the what they call the click-throughs to the different ads, and they put about 6 ads. We work with Missional Marketing, a company out of Phoenix, does an outstanding job, and they create all these and they put them up for us. And in looking at the statistics, the reports afterwards, what we saw was that my first question was, well, how come one of these 6 ads got looked at more often? And they said, well, as the way Facebook and Instagram do it, as an ad gets clicked on more times by somebody and read, it elevates that up to a higher level. And so you've got a hierarchy, and every time I get the report, you show where some ads, and you'd think, I'd look at them and think, well, why would they not click on that one? But they don't. And so another one may get a lot more, but that's advertising, folks. It varies, and you can't always predict. And that's why they do several different variations, and then they have the ability to have those rise to the top. And the ones that get more clicks get presented more often. It's very fascinating technology. But what they also show is what kind of a device does somebody see our ad from, or log into our Northside website from. They have how long somebody is on our website, how many pages did they look at, what's the average time they stayed on each page. I mean, there's all kinds of data out there. And the fascinating thing is the phone, I thought, because I use my iPad a lot, I like the bigger text and the bigger screen. Even though it's the smallest one they make, it's still a lot bigger than the phone. The phone gets about, as I recall, in the latest report, about 88% of the views are on people's smartphones. Part of the reason, of course, is it's with them all the time. But so what surprised me was that desktop computers, being any kind of laptop or desktop, regular PC type computer or Apple computer, is next, and the tablet devices were last. Well, that was a wake-up call for me. But those are the kind of things that Barna studies as well in our things, and we're going to be looking at. So if we come back to the Beatitudes and we look at the fruit of the Spirit, then the question becomes, we look at what do we need to do differently in the way that we think and the kind of conversations that we have with God. The thing that we run into frequently, and I would say that probably all of us are impacted by this to some extent, and that is going to a church, attending a service, and going back again because I'm comfortable and it's what I like and it meets my needs. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then the other question is that the only perspective we should have about our relationship with Christ? And so we get into the thinking of, well, what is it that God wants for me to have in my relationship with Him? So I would point you to some questions. And if you look at number 3 on the back side of that sheet of paper, how can and how should we best understand what the nature of our relationship with God should be? What questions should we be asking of Him? You want one of these? Sorry. Does anybody else need one of these? And if we look at it, there are several levels here where do we tell God what we want in our relationship with Him? I would suggest that probably no. Maybe sometimes we do. We're asking for Him for something, but we're kind of thinking about, okay, this is what I want and not what you want. And we know most of the time that we're saying, if it's your will. But there's also that part that we may occasionally do. But do we ask God what He wants for us to have in our relationship with Him? Because if we approach it from the standpoint of what we're looking for, kind of like I said in the beginning, where we go to a church and we are looking for something that we're looking for. We've kind of set the parameters of, am I comfortable with this place? Are the people nice? And all of these kind of things. And we're familiar with those kind of reactions and conversations that people have when they're trying out something, when they're checking into something. We have, Judy Biddick told me that in the Loaves and Fishes ministry, at one point a few months ago, that there are more people who are not members at Northside and don't attend, at that time didn't, who are coming and helping on Saturday mornings and other days of the week to prepare the sandwiches and the meals that go on the food truck to go down in our homeless ministry. I was excited about that, because people here who do that have gone out and asked their friends and invited their friends to come and join them in doing that. And as a result, that's one of the first ways that we will look at in how do we reach out to the community. I spent quite a few years ago, I was in a job where I was putting on benefit promotions for a charitable organization. Here in San Antonio, it was a battered women's shelter, and managing a lot of apartment complexes, and we would put a benefit on and donate the proceeds of the activity to the local charity. In Fort Worth, we did others. In other cities, we'd find another local charity. And the interesting thing we found was that there would be a lot of people who were residents in the apartments, and the management would always go out and try and recruit people to help. And they would come looking for me or one of the other managers at the end of the day, and they'd been out there working in the heat and sweating and working, we found earlier, also for weeks in advance as we prepped for this. And they would be thanking us for the opportunity to do all that work and to help, because it helped the charity. And folks, I will tell you, you look around in the world, there are lots and lots of people around us right here who are like that. They're looking for a place to serve and to be connected and to contribute and to make a difference with what they can do in their lives. And that's the kind of heart that God's looking for, because they're open to serving other people and not getting anything back in return. And so that's what I think we're seeing with the loaves and fishes, where we've got people that live near here. They know somebody at Northside, and they come and they want to. Glenda and I had a friend, used to be our next door neighbor, and we invited him. He was a former Army medic. So, I mean, already, he's a person who's willing to serve in multiple levels. And we asked him if he wanted to come, and he jumped at the chance. Came up and came with us on several Saturdays and attended a few services. He moved away to Washington now, but he's a very close friend. But that's just an example of some of the things. But the question is, for us to get to the level of relationship with God that He's looking for is different from the one to get to the level of relationship with God that we're looking for. And I think part of that comes to the self-emptying concept, where Jesus emptied Himself, and He calls on us to do the same thing. And that is to turn that question around and say, and to recognize, we don't know all of the things that God wants us to have in our relationship with Him. And so I want to encourage you to be asking the question of Him in your prayers in that way. Lord, what is it that you know you want me to have? The dimension of our relationship. And one thing that the profound verses in the entire Old Testament is in Genesis 3:8. And the dichotomy here is, it's the verse that has disaster, starts with disaster in it. Well, it ends with disaster. It starts with this concept. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God. Now, I want you all to picture with me. Let's just go there. They're in the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve heard the sound of God as He was through the garden. It's telling us they knew what it sounded like. But the other thing is, you think about Moses and asking God to see his face, and God says, no man can see my face and live. And yet Adam and Eve did. The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as He was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So at evening, the sun is low in the horizon or already set. The air goes flat and calm. Everything gets kind of quiet. Now, imagine it was pretty quiet in the Garden of Eden as well. But here you can relate to that, because for some reason the traffic noise and other things, changes in the atmosphere occur at that time of day, and there's a quiet that happens. As a pilot, I can tell you it's one of the nicest times to go fly, because the air is just calm as it can be. You don't get turbulence and bumps, and it's like you're just suspended in space. And so here's this sublime peace. And that was God's time to go and be with His children and to spend that in interaction and love with them. Now, He knew this day that wasn't going to happen. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. And he called out to them and says, "Where are you?" And they said, "We hid because we were naked." It was the funny part. "We were naked and we were afraid." And he said, "Who told you you were naked?" But that's the picture that God has, that he wants for us to have with him, in that type of intimate bond of love and companionship and connection. And if we're not asking the right question, Marvin, to paraphrase or to use a motivational speaker's words, we're living below our privilege. God has in store for us, and what he wants for us is far beyond what we typically would imagine in that relationship. And hopefully that will be one of the things that comes out of our study together. And the next thing is, because that's our focus, and I would encourage you to think about that and pray about that and to ask him. The other thing is, in God, what it is that he wants us to have in the nature of our relationship with him, the next thing is, how am I going to find out? My suggestion to you is, it's not just going to be by reading the Bible. It's going to be through life experiences. And everybody in here has had different life experiences and different challenges. And quite often those challenges are the ways in which God shows us the level of relationship that he's seeking to have with us, but seeking us to have with him. And so that's one level of focus. But there's another level of focus, and I'll refer to a story that I read in a book many years ago. A fellow went to a conference, a business conference, and it was a multi-day thing and lasted 3 or 4 days. And the very first day, the speaker gets up, the main speaker, and he says, "Focus on quarters." It's like, what? Do what? He says, "Focus on quarters." And they say, what are you talking about? He said, how many of you found a quarter lying around somewhere in the past week? No hands go up. There's several hundred people in the room. None? Any? Couple of hands go up, How many quarters? 1, 2. Okay. But he said, focus on quarters. At the end of the conference, the last day, he comes back. How many of you have found quarters since this conference started? Over half the hands go up. He said, how many found more than 2? About a third of the hands go up. He said, how many found more than 3? More hands go up. And so his point was well made. It's focus. What do we focus on? And what Jesus focused on, you go back to his example, is he focused on people. He focused on looking for people who had some sort of a need and then meeting that need. And that, as we go through, is going to be the focus that we have, is to help us develop the eyes for looking around us at the people around us and the world around us to see what needs might there be. There's programs, interestingly, and I'll tell you how God works, and we'll close with this. Good friend of mine was a member here for about 9 years. We were in business together for several years. And while we both had to go get jobs after the crash in the 80s in the real estate business, his sent him to Vancouver, Washington. And they've been there ever since. He served as an elder in the Vancouver church. And I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago about what I was going to be doing in this class and teaching, and our focus on being missional. And he told me that they have a program at the Vancouver church where they have adopted 3 public elementary schools. And I'm going to get more detail on that, and I'll share it with you as we go through the class this summer. And they will go in and they've gotten the approvals and done background checks, whatever they needed to, for people at the church to go in and do birthday parties for the kids and do other things and put on some events. And they send cards, birthday cards, and they send cards of encouragement to the teachers and things like that. And I thought, my goodness, what an awesome concept, because that's going out to the people. It's going out and doing things. Number one, they've got to be asking, well, what can we do for you? But the second thing is, we already know a lot of that stuff, folks. People love to be able to be acknowledged when they're having a birthday, especially children, and the teachers appreciate that. And there's so many things that the teachers are struggling with these days in our public education system, that words of encouragement and cards and letters are always going to be appreciated and beneficial. And that's beginning to build that relationship with those teachers and all of the families that are represented in those schools. So a week later, after Mike and I had that conversation, Tina called me up. And she said her daughter is doing something and where a church has adopted an elementary school here. Would you be interested in talking about this? Because I'm the lead on local outreach ministry. And so that's why Tina called me. I said, I think the message is, we don't have a choice. This is what we're supposed to be doing. So through 2,000 miles apart, same thing is happening in two different places. Now, her daughter's in Abilene, and they're doing it up in Abilene, but she and I are going to get together and get the details, and I'm going to pick Mike's brain and find out more detail. This is the kind of thing that gets to the how of being missional in our community. And that's just one illustration. There are other examples. Obviously, loaves and fishes is another. But as we look at the ministries that we're doing here locally, there are opportunities for us to reach the people around us who may be looking for some way to serve the community. And when you think about loaves and fishes, it's a perfect illustration of that, because we're doing something for people that we expect nothing in return. As was pointed out, that Jesus did. They expect nothing in return. We're not going to get anything back from them. We're serving because that's what Jesus calls us to do, and we're feeding the homeless, and we're ministering to them, and we're sharing the message of the gospel whenever we have the opportunity to, whenever anybody's willing and interested in and seeking that. But it's the same thing when we go to Fisher House and we serve those people. It's not just the people that are the soldiers and their families that we come in contact with that are being ministered to, but think about all of the staff people that work here in San Antonio, that work at the Fisher houses, and the contacts and their families, and the conversation that goes on about those Christians that come in once or twice a month on a Saturday and feed all of our wounded soldiers in those houses. Rebecca Light is working in the SAFE ministry, and they do things that's supporting adoption and fostering efforts, I think is what SAFE, but that's what it's about, adoption and fostering. How many young couples are there who have trouble having children, or even have some, and we've got some here at Northside, and have decided to adopt, or they're acting as foster parents? They're all around us in our community, and all of the things that she's doing in that ministry are areas that we come in contact with people in our community. So there's lots and lots of things that can be done. And we'll go back to the point I started with last week, and that is where Jesus said the cup of cold water concept. He lowered the bar on what we can do to be serving Him and serving those around us, to giving someone a cup of cold water. It's not hard. The key is having the mindset to be focusing on what can we do, and then how could we do it. And then as we go through this, we'll be also looking for, what's the feedback? What are y'all thinking? What are you finding out? What are you coming up with? Because we want to put ideas on the table and be able to conduct those. Bob, would you mind leading us in a closing prayer?
Father, we thank you for today and the blessing of this class. ways to serve others through you, and that we don't consider anything too small. Help us to get engaged and follow your lead in the way that we serve our community and those around us. These things we ask in your Son's name.
Amen. Thank you. I have on the sheet that you have, if you'll look down at the bottom of the second page for next week, there's 3 points there that you might look at, and we will be discussing next week. Thank you.